In the heart of Duskhaven, a town cloaked in the gentle embrace of twilight year-round, the legend of the Watchman was as perennial as the cobblestone streets that wound through it. Parents whispered tales of the sentinel who guarded the dreams of children, a mythical figure etched into the town's history, standing vigilant against the creeping dread of the Boogeyman. It was a brisk evening when the calm of Duskhaven was shattered. A chilling wind wove through the elms in the Central Park, carrying with it a discordant tone that unsettled the night. The Watchman, once a towering statue that children would circle with glee, was found desecrated, hollowed out, an empty chrysalis of stone, its protective aura siphoned away. The town reeled as the silence of a missing child hung heavily in the air. Whispers turned to wails, and doors bolted shut as dusk approached. It was not just the loss that tormented the people. It was the betrayal of safety, the shattering of an age-old promise. Among the disarray, Ellis strode with purpose, her eyes reflecting a glint of resolve where others saw only fear. She was a journalist who had built a reputation on unearthing truths, often hidden beneath layers of superstition and hearsay. To her, the Watchman was a story, nothing more. A story that now demanded an ending. Why must every shadow be haunted by childhood fables? There has to be a rational explanation, she mused, her inner voice a constant companion questioning every whispered legend. Ellis began her investigation at the heart, the park where the Watchman stood sentinel. The police tape flapped like a morbid pennant as she circled the hollow figure, her notebook filled with observations, questions, and the occasional sketch. She noted the absence of debris, the lack of any physical evidence that could explain the violation of the statue. The townsfolk watched her with a medley of skepticism and hope. To them, she was an outsider, despite her years among them, a skeptic who dared question the unseen forces they revered. Yet, in her search for answers, there was a silent prayer that she might restore what was lost. As night encroached, Ellis returned to her study, walls lined with the lore and history of Duskhaven. She pored over texts, old newspapers, personal accounts of the Watchman's vigil, looking for anything that the fear-stricken eyes of the town might have missed. Each article, each tale spun a deeper enigma around the Watchman, a tapestry of belief that had enshrouded the town for generations. The story was unraveling, and Ellis felt the weight of it. She couldn't shake the feeling that the key to the children's disappearances lay with the Watchman's fate, and time was a luxury they could not afford. There's a thread here, woven into the town's very fabric. If the Watchman is a lie, who then has been keeping the Boogeyman at bay? The thought lingered in her mind as she stared into the dark outside her window. The answer was there, somewhere in the inky depths of Duskhaven's past. She just needed to find it before the Boogeyman claimed the night. The nights in Duskhaven were never pitch black. The mist that enveloped the town saw to that, casting a silvery sheen over everything it touched. But that night, as her gaze pierced through the window pane, the mist seemed to recoil, as if afraid of what lay beyond. A single bulb flickered above her desk, throwing erratic shadows across the piles of research she had amassed. The Watchman's legend, once a mere backdrop to Duskhaven's quaint charm, now seemed to mock her from every page, every whispered rumor. She sifted through the archives, her fingers brushing against the brittle pages of a community's collective memory. As she delved deeper, the journalist in her began to piece together a timeline, each event a breadcrumb leading back to the Watchman. Yet, for all her logic and deduction, the answers remained as elusive as the whispers of the Boogeyman in a child's ear. What am I missing? She wondered, frustration mounting. Her inner dialogue, typically a beacon of reason, now seemed to tangle with the threads of myth she attempted to unravel. The town clock struck midnight, its chimes resonating through the stillness of her study. It was a sound that signaled an end to the day, but for Ellis, it heralded the beginning of a new chapter in her investigation. With a weary sigh, she stood and stretched, the hours of research taking their toll on her body. A sudden rapping at the door jarred her from her thoughts. Who could be calling at this late hour? Duskhaven was a town that cherished its evenings for the refuge of family and the solace of home, not for unexpected visitors cloaked in darkness. Ellis approached the door with caution, her hand finding the cold brass of the doorknob. The rapping persisted, more urgent now. She swung the door open to find a child, no older than 8, his eyes wide with a terror that no innocence should know. "Miss Ellis," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "My sister, she's gone." The boy's words fractured into sobs, his small frame trembling in the doorway. Ellis knelt before him, her investigative guise giving way to a more human concern. She ushered him inside, wrapping him in a blanket, and offered a warm cup of cocoa, a mundane comfort against a night of unknown horrors. As the boy clutched the mug with both hands, Ellis listened. He spoke of shadows that danced at the window, of a lullaby that soured into a sinister hum, of a fear so palpable it seemed to consume the very air he breathed. Her mind raced. This was no longer just a story, a puzzle to solve. It was real, and it was happening now. The children of Duskhaven needed a protector, and with the Watchman gone, she felt a resolve awaken within her, a determination to stand where others could not. "We are the Watchmen, each of us. It's not about guardians or monsters, it's about facing the darkness together," she thought, her convictions solidifying. With the break of dawn, Ellis would set out to confront the Boogeyman's tale, armed with her notes, her wits, and a newfound duty. The legend of the Watchman would not end in tragedy, not if she had any say in the matter. Tonight, Duskhaven's children had lost a guardian. But in the heart of one determined woman, the spirit of the Watchman endured, ready to face whatever lay hidden in the shadows. The dawn crept over Duskhaven like a cautious observer, peeking through the curtains of mist that had settled upon the town overnight. Ellis hadn't slept. Her mind was a whirring machine, piecing together the fragments of a story that seemed to splinter further with every touch. She set out with the first light, her steps leading her back to the park where the Watchman's husk stood, a sentinel now robbed of its watch. The morning dew lay heavy upon the grass, untouched but for the path that Ellis carved through it to the center of the tragedy. The air was thick with whispers as the townsfolk gathered, their eyes drawn to the hollow statue that once promised safety. Her presence was a silent challenge to the hysteria that threatened to boil over. Her questions punctured the veil of fear, probing for facts amid the fog of superstition. She pressed the parents for details, her voice a steady cadence against the tremble of their replies. Each account was a piece of the puzzle, a shadow here, a lullaby there, all threading back to the eviscerated Watchman. As she collected stories, a pattern began to emerge, tethered to an old poem that the town's elders recited. The verses spoke of a pact between the Watchman and the people of Duskhaven, a pact forged in a time forgotten, its terms lost to the ages. There's a thread here, woven into the town's very fabric. If the Watchman is a lie, who then has been keeping the Boogeyman at bay? The question haunted her, a riddle wrapped in the enigma of the town's past. Back in her study, the walls seemed to close in, lined with the grim faces of the missing children, their photographs staring back at her from the case files. With each child's disappearance, the Boogeyman's legend grew, fed by the town's collective dread. Ellis's research led her to the local library, a building as old as the myth it housed within. The librarian, a wizened figure named Martha, recognized the fervor in her eyes. It was the same look that had claimed many before her, those who sought to untangle the town's lore. Martha guided Ellis through the archives, her fingers gliding over the spines of ancient tomes until they came upon a leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age. The book spoke of the origins of the Watchman, a guardian spirit conjured by the town's founders to protect their offspring from the darkness they feared. But the Boogeyman was more than just a night terror to be whispered about at bedtime. It was a force, a living embodiment of fear that fed on the terror of its prey. And with the Watchman's fall, it had been unleashed, unfettered by the bonds that had held it at bay. The townsfolk's desperation was unsettling as the sun dipped below the horizon once more. Parents clutched their children tight, their nightly vigils a feeble defense against a foe they could not see. Ellis understood now that the Watchman was not just a protector. It was a symbol, a beacon of hope that held the Boogeyman at arm's length. With the statue's desecration, that hope had been shattered, and the town was left vulnerable to the creeping emotions of fear. Fear is the real enemy here, more tangible than any Boogeyman could ever be. The realization struck Ellis with the force of a revelation. If the town was to survive, they needed to reclaim that hope, to rekindle the Watchman's flame. With night's approach, a plan began to form in Ellis's mind, a daring strategy to face the darkness. She would not let the Boogeyman's shadow engulf Duskhaven. She would find the missing children and restore the Watchman's vigil, even if she had to stand watch herself. The night was coming, and with it, a confrontation that would decide the fate of the town. Ellis was ready to face the darkness, armed with the light of truth that burned within her. The dusk settled over Duskhaven like an ominous shroud, its usual comforting twilight now a harbinger of the sinister. Ellis felt it in her bones, a creeping dread that seeped through the cracks of the town's facade, whispering of the darkness that lay in wait. She met with a group of parents in the park, their faces etched with the lines of sleepless nights and worry. Together, they stood before the Watchman's hollowed husk, a monolith of their shattered sanctuary. This was where the children had played in the light of day, their laughter a melody that now seemed lost to the wind. As the group steeled themselves against the encroaching night, Ellis couldn't help but feel the weight of their collective gaze. They looked to her, not as a savior, but as the bearer of a plan, any plan, that could lead them out of this nightmare. Fear is the real enemy here. More tangible than any Boogeyman could ever be, she reminded herself. The journalist in her clung to the logic, to the evidence. But as the night drew its cloak tighter around them, even she could not deny the visceral fear that clawed at the edges of her mind. The darkness seemed to swell, pressing in on them with an almost physical force. The group clung to each other, their vigils, lamps, and flashlights mere pinpricks against the suffocating black. Then, the hallucinations began. Shadows twisted into grotesque figures, the trees bent toward them with gnarled fingers, and the wind carried a low, mocking tone. Ellis fought to keep her composure, to remind the parents that these were tricks of the mind, but the terror was infectious. In the chaos of their fear, Ellis saw it. The Boogeyman, not as a creature of flesh, but as a manifestation of their deepest dreads. It was an entity that thrived on the very fear it incited, a vicious cycle that had now found its zenith with the town at its most vulnerable. The reality of the Boogeyman was no longer confined to the whispers of children. It was alive in the hysteria of the town, a palpable force that fed and grew. The mythos of the Watchman unraveled before Ellis's eyes, its threads twisting into a tapestry of horror that draped over Duskhaven. The night wore on, each hour a grueling testament to the town's resilience. Ellis's mind raced, searching for a way to break the cycle, to dispel the darkness that the Boogeyman had woven around them. As the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon with gray, the hallucinations faded, leaving the group exhausted but intact. The Boogeyman had retreated with the night, but the threat remained, a promise of terror that would return with the coming dusk. Ellis's faith in the logical world was shaken, but not broken. The Boogeyman was real as the fear it inspired, and if the Watchman's myth had once held it at bay, then perhaps the solution lay in the legend itself. The town's belief had faltered, but Ellis knew that to fight this foe, they needed more than just belief. They needed to become the Watchman, to embody the courage that the legend represented. It was not about a statue or a singular guardian. It was about the collective will of the people to stand against the night. with the new day came a new resolve. Ellis would not let the Boogeyman claim another child, another night of terror. She would delve into the heart of the myth, into the very essence of fear, and she would find a way to bring the children home. For in the end, the Boogeyman was not a creature of the dark, but a shadow cast by their own fears. And shadows, no matter how dark, would always yield to the light.